Fantastic. All right, we are recording. We are, I guess, most of us who are going to be here. And Professor Shou, thank you so much again for being here. And yeah, we eagerly await this conversation.
All right, well, let me go ahead and share my screen. So I've got quite a bit here. I'll just go through what I have, and if I take up too much time, just let me know, and I can end early. This is going to be basically a summary of everything I've written on this topic, which is quite a bit. And so a lot of what I say here is going to be developed in further detail in the stuff I've written. And so if you're interested, I can give you, links, or I can email you the articles I've written. But this is sort of just like an executive summary of everything that I've written on this issue in the past, 5 or 6 years. So animals, why it's okay to kill or to hunt and eat them. And so here's the layout of the presentation. Here's what I'm going to, the basic structure. So I'll start off by giving a framework for understanding moral status and rights. What does it mean to be morally significant? What does it mean to have rights? And then we look at the question, why animals don't have moral standing? What qualities are necessary for moral standing, and why do animals lack those qualities? Then we'll look at, we'll just summarize everything, into the argument of why it's okay to hunt and eat animals. And then I'm going to respond to some popular arguments on the animal rights side, the vegan side, against the morality of hunting and eating meat. And some of these arguments are going to be the argument from pain, so the argument from sentience, animals can feel pain, the argument from marginal cases, and I have marginal cases in quotation marks because I don't actually think there are marginal cases. And then the argument, this is popular on the internet, called name the trait. And it sort of dovetails with the speciesism argument, basically that any quality you pick out that, gives humans rights but not animals is going to be morally arbitrary. And finally is a really common argument that I see from people affiliated with PETA or PETA type people. You wouldn't eat your dog, so why would you eat a cow or a chicken? And along the way, we'll look at, there's one more argument actually, and this is the argument that essentialism is unscientific. And so a lot of what I'll be saying here rests on essentialism and teleology as sort of metaphysical preconditions. And this final argument has been made by some philosophers, and they argue that, this way of thinking, the idea that humans are exceptional, doesn't fit into our modern scientific framework. And so we should abandon belief in human exceptionalism and think of everybody as existing, all species or all animals as existing on some kind of continuum. So there's no fundamental difference between human beings and animals. So I'll look at all these pro animal rights, pro vegan arguments, and I'll respond to them. But first, before we can talk about whether it's okay to hunt animals, whether it's okay to eat them, we need to have a framework for what does it mean to have moral standing? What does it mean to have rights? What does it mean to be a member of the moral community? And I'm going to give an argument here that doesn't rely on really anything too controversial. I think, in fact, most major moral theories could sign on to at least the basic, the premises I'm giving here. And so this doesn't require any kind of commitment to a controversial metaphysical system or an epistemological framework or anything like that. It's pretty, I think, straightforward. So here's the first part of the argument. Morality is about the pursuit of good and the avoidance of evil. And I think this point, all major moral theories seem to be in agreement on this. Whether you're a deontologist, whether you're utilitarian, whether you're a virtue ethicist, morality is about being good. It's about pursuing what's good, avoiding what's evil. Now, they might differ on what counts as good and evil. But so for example, the deontologist might think, it's about fulfilling duties. And the utilitarian might think, no, it's about utility maximization. We don't have to settle that debate here. What they have in common, though, is that the whole point of moral theorizing, moral thinking, moral deliberation, the moral life is about taking, whatever we call good and pursuing that and avoiding whatever we call evil. So that point, I think everyone can agree on. Now, what this shows, however, is that morality is about a certain kind of activity, namely activity in pursuit of what's good and avoidance of what's evil. Now, this point will be key later on to establishing the framework of moral status that I want to defend here. But so far, I mean, I don't think any of this is really too controversial. The real difference here between most major moral theories is, okay, how do we pursue what's good? How do we avoid what's evil? What counts as good? What counts as evil? But again, we don't have to really settle this question right here, right now. So moving on, in order to pursue good and avoid evil, you have to know what good and evil are. You can't pursue good if you don't know what goodness is. You can't avoid evil if you don't know what evil is. So knowledge goes together with action. Knowledge and action are, you might think, two things that are inherently linked. You can't act for the sake of good if you don't know, what the good is. So the two fundamental objects of morality are knowledge and action. Morality is about pursuing what's good. And again, you can't pursue what's good if you don't know what good is. And you can't avoid what's evil if you don't know what evil is. And so, again, this doesn't require any specific conception of the good. This is just, the framework that we're working with so far. You can fill in the good or the bad or the evil with whatever, meta-ethic or normative ethic system you want to fill in with. But I think this point right here, again, is pretty uncontroversial. So the point of morality is to pursue good and avoid evil. And here's where I think everything starts to fit together. You might think, how does this, what relevance does this have for animal rights or moral standing of animals? Well, in order to pursue good and avoid evil, again, you have to know what good and evil are. And again, only beings who are capable of doing this count as part of the moral community. If you aren't capable of pursuing good and avoiding evil, if you aren't capable of doing what morality is about, in what sense are you part of the moral community? And so in order to pursue good and avoid evil, you have to know what's good. You have to be able to act for the sake of that knowledge. In other words, you have to be a rational being. Only rational beings are capable of pursuing good and avoiding evil. Only rational beings can know what's good and know what's evil and act for that sake. Now, do animals have rationality? Well, animals certainly have intelligence. Animals are really smart, and I don't think anyone denies that. I mean, you look at the literature on this topic. Animals can solve problems. Animals can engage in really complex behaviors, but are they rational? Now, you might think, well, you can have moral standing without having to be rational. But go back to what I just said about what morality is about. Morality is about the pursuit of good and the avoidance of evil. Now, what this means then is that to be a member of the moral community, to have any kind of moral significance, you have to be capable of knowing what's good and pursuing, it for that reason. And so you can't have moral standing unless you're rational. So it doesn't make sense to say that, well, maybe animals can have some amount of moral standing, even if they aren't rational. Some philosophers will say that, well, animals, moral standing is something that comes in degrees, and that animals can have some of it, even if they don't have the full amount that we do. But on the account of moral standing I defend here, it's an all or nothing package. It's something that all comes together. You can't have moral standing unless you are rational. So if you read the animal rights literature, Tom Regan, for example, says, well, animals can be moral patients. A moral patient is someone who is the subject of moral protections, even though they aren't capable of acting for the sake of moral reasons. But on the account I defend here and in my written work, this is just incoherent. There is no such thing as a moral patient, a true moral patient, which is incapable of having any duties in principle. So the concept of moral standing, I guess if you want to adopt this approach where you can have different degrees of moral standing, you might think of rights as having a higher degree of moral standing, and moral standing in general being something just deserving of a minimal amount of moral consideration. But again, on the account of rights or the account of moral standing I defend here, animals don't have any of it. At least because I'm getting ahead of myself, but animals either have it or they don't. It's not that they have some of it and we have more of it. It's an all or nothing concept. Now, when it comes to rights, and really, depending on who you read in the animal rights literature, this argument is sometimes framed differently. So someone like Tom Reagan defends animal rights. He thinks animals have, these special claims that we also have, not to be killed, not to be used as property, so on and so forth. Whereas if you read someone like maybe Peter Singer, for example, Peter Singer thinks that the language of rights is convenient. It's a convenient shorthand, but he doesn't technically believe in rights at all because he's a utilitarian. Peter Singer believes animals have moral standing or moral status or moral consideration, but he doesn't like to use the language of rights. And so I don't think we need to get too much into this, because on the account I defend, whether you think animals have rights in the robust sense or whether they have just moral standing in general, they can't have any of that if they're not rational. So, but let's talk about rights for a second, because the rights talk is very big in the literature. What is a right? Well, we can define a right as a claim or entitlement to have a good, or to have some good provided to you, or to be allowed to pursue some good. So a right, you might think of a right as a kind of claim. It functions as a moral shield. Rights guard us; they guard our flourishing, and rights exist because our flourishing is morally significant. Now, why is our flourishing morally significant? Why are we deserving of moral protection? Well, we're rational beings. We're capable of pursuing the good, and we're capable of understanding what goodness and badness are. And so because morality is about pursuing good and avoiding evil, we need some kind of protection as we go about fulfilling our obligations, developing our talents, unfolding, our capacities and dispositions. And that's where rights come in. Rights have a guarding function. Rights guard us because we have the obligation to pursue our flourishing. And if we didn't have that obligation, there would be no need to protect our interests. So the reason we have rights is because we have obligations. Rights and obligations go together. And only rational beings have obligations. And so only rational beings can have rights. Now, one common argument against this that I'll cover towards the end is known as the argument from marginal cases. And this is the argument that, well, babies and infants aren't moral agents. They don't seem to be under any obligations at the moment, at least. And so they still have rights, though, right? Even though they aren't moral agents in the sense that, developed human beings like you and I are. But I'll get to that towards the end. The response to that is that human beings are, all human beings have a rational nature, whereas animals don't have a rational nature. And having a rational nature is what grounds rights and duties. But I'm getting a bit too ahead of myself. So why don't animals have moral standing? Well, animals don't have moral standing because they can't have duties. And they don't have duties because they're not rational. The most basic moral duty is to pursue good and avoid evil. Again, it doesn't matter how you fill that in. I think all major moral theories agree that whatever you define good as, pursue it. Whatever you define evil as, don't pursue that. And so why don't animals have duties? Well, animals don't have a mind capable of understanding good and evil. Animals aren't rational in the sense required for moral knowledge, which is not to say animals aren't rational in some other sense, or animals don't have ration, or in the ability to make decisions that are really smart. Animals do have a mental life, but they lack the kind of rationality or reason necessary for moral knowledge. Now, this third point I have here isn't essential to what I'm saying here, but it does dovetail nicely with the Aristotelian account that I'm defending. The whole framework that I'm approaching things from is sort of an Aristotelian Thomistic way of looking at morality, although most of the metaphysical commitments aren't really necessary for me to make my argument here. So you could strip all the controversial stuff out if you want to, and all this would still go. So goodness, what does it mean for something to be good? Well, something is good if it fulfills something's nature or function. So a good pencil is one that writes well because the function of a pencil is to write. A good car is a car that, transports you from point A to point B because that's the function of a car. A good teacher is one that imparts knowledge, in an effective manner because that is the function or role of a teacher. And so being a good person, being a good being, means being the kind of being who is able to pursue that being's flourishing by unfolding its capacities. And so to understand what goodness is, you have to understand the concept of a nature or an essence and functions that flow from that. Now, the question is, do animals have that kind of intellect? Do they have that kind of mind that gives them the kind of knowledge that would be required for moral knowledge? And I've got, let's see here, two arguments against that. Two arguments as to why animals kind of knowledge, which is, again, I'm not saying animals don't have knowledge or animals aren't intelligent. I'm saying that whatever kind of intelligence they do have, it's not the kind of intelligence relevant to moral standing. So the first argument here is the argument from blame. And here is my summary of the argument. If animals did have moral knowledge, they would be morally responsible, but animals are not morally responsible, so animals don't have moral knowledge. Whoops. And if animals don't have moral knowledge, then they're not, they aren't capable of, pursuing good and avoiding evil. Now, why aren't animals morally responsible? Well, and I think this is pretty intuitive for most people. You look at nature, when the lion kills the zebra, is the lion guilty of a moral wrong, of a moral crime? If animals really did have moral knowledge, they would be accountable for what they did, meaning that we'd have to put the lion on trial for killing the zebra. We'd have to, intervene in nature to make sure animals aren't killing each other. We'd have to, maybe set up courts to adjudicate between, animal injustices, or to resolve all these instances of killing that occur in nature. But we all recognize that, the lion just kills the zebra. It doesn't murder the zebra. All these bad things that happen in nature aren't the product of moral malice. It's animals don't have a guilty mind. They just do what they do, and they don't know any better. But if animals did have moral knowledge, if animals were capable of the kind of intellect required for pursuing what's good and avoiding what's evil, then they would be morally responsible. But the fact that we don't think animals are morally responsible means that we don't actually think the kind of intelligence they have is relevant for moral standing. So that's the first argument. Second argument is called the argument from achievement. Premise one: if animals had the kind of mind necessary for moral knowledge, then it would be an intellect like ours. Premise two: animals don't have an intellect like ours, so therefore animals don't have the kind of mind necessary for moral knowledge. Now, why accept premise one? Well, as I said earlier, understanding what's good requires that you understand something's nature or function. You have to have what medieval philosophers called the agent intellect. And this kind of mind is a mind capable of grasping essences. It's a mind capable of abstraction, of generalizing, of doing operations that are not limited to the here and now. So this kind of mind would be a mind like ours, a mind capable of understanding universals, a mind capable of grasping essences. And so if an animal did have a mind like ours, we should expect to see evidence of that in nature. And from everything we see in nature, animals don't seem to have that kind of mind. Animals don't produce works of poetry. Animals don't produce civilization. Animals don't, put together treatises on philosophy or theology or any of that kind of stuff, which is all evidence that whatever kind of mind animals have, it's not the kind of mind that you and I have, the kind of mind that's able to, understand universals, to engage in abstraction, to engage in generalization. That kind of mind is not a mind that would be, limited to really specific activities or circumstances. It is not limited by, I mean, the idea of grasping a universal, right? A universal is something that can be instantiated in many different things. And so that kind of mind would be the same kind of mind that would produce, works of poetry, works of philosophy, human civilization. And yet we don't see any of that in the animals. And so whatever mind animals do have, it doesn't seem to be the kind of mind that's that grounds moral knowledge, which in turn grounds having obligations, which in turn grounds membership in the moral community. So it seems as if animals don't have moral standing because they don't have the kind of mind necessary to give them the things they need to be members of them, to pursue what's good and to avoid what's evil. So from that, it follows that animals don't have moral standing. So why is it okay to hunt and eat animals? Well, we've concluded so far, animals don't have moral standing at all. And so if they don't have moral standing, hunting them or eating them doesn't violate any rights or any morally significant interests that they have. And so if it doesn't wrong them in that way, then it would seem to be morally permissible to engage in hunting or eating, which is not to say that it's always okay. You might think of hunting or eating as being sometimes conditionally wrong, but not for reasons pertaining to the moral status of animals. It would be wrong for maybe extrinsic reasons. Maybe, for example, hunting a species threatens biodiversity, which in turn threatens, human well-being. Or maybe, eating certain animals would be wrong because it harms your body. But it wouldn't be wrong because it harms the interests of the animals. And this would include things like factory farming and trophy hunting. If animals don't have moral standing at all, then there is nothing wrong in principle with farming them at the industrial level. There's nothing wrong with the concentrated animal feeding operations, which is not to say that they can't be conditionally wrong. And I'll talk about this a bit later, but it is possible to do something that would otherwise be morally permissible, but with, say, a cruel disposition, and that would make certain instances of using animals wrong. But trophy hunting and factory farming are, in principle, morally permissible because animals don't have moral standing. Now, I have an entire paper. I've actually got two papers on this. I've got one paper on factory farming and one paper on trophy hunting. And I give the paper on trophy hunting, I give a really specific argument for the conclusion that trophy hunting is okay. I use an argument from analogy. I basically say, look, if it's okay to cut down trees and turn those trees into ornate furniture or trophies, then it's also morally permissible to do the same thing with animals. Now you might think, well, there's disanalogies there. Animals can feel pain, trees can't. Well, I run through a list of qualities that might be alleged disanalogies, and I find that they don't really affect the argument here. So far, we've concluded, and this is, again, all a really quick summary of my written work, and you can consult that if you want to. But so far, we've seem to conclude that animals don't have moral standing, and so it's okay to hunt, it's okay to eat them, even at the industrial level, even for something like factory farming or trophy hunting. Now, so animals are fair game, pun intended. Feel free to eat and hunt animals. Now let's look at some common, really quickly, I think I'm running out of time here. Let's look at some common arguments against my position, or common arguments for the claim that animals have moral standing. So here's the first argument. The first argument is that animals can feel pain, and pain matters. And so because animals can feel pain, they have some amount of moral standing. This is a really common argument in the animal ethics literature. It's a really minimalist argument too. It doesn't require you to commit to the language of rights. All the strength of this argument is that all you have to say is that pain matters. And whether you think that's in terms of rights or something else, as long as pain matters, animals matter, right? Because animals can feel pain. And so you see this kind of argument ran by James Rachels. He's got a really well-known article titled The Basic Argument for Vegetarianism. David DeGrazia has an article titled Moral Vegetarianism from a Very Broad Basis. And it's a very broad basis because he thinks, look, whatever moral theory you subscribe to, you can think that pain matters. And as long as pain matters, again, animals matter too. So what's wrong with this argument? Well, I don't deny that pain matters. Pain matters for us, but what I do deny is that pain matters intrinsically. To feel pain is to have a certain kind of experience, right? If I feel pain, I have an experience that I don't like. That is what pain is. But look back to what I said about moral standing. What grounds moral standing? It's rationality. Now, you might have experiences that enhance the rational life, but experiences themselves don't confer the things necessary to be a moral agent, to be a member of the moral community. And so, which is not so sometimes people will say, well, you're denying animals feel pain. Well, no, I'm not. I'm not saying animals don't feel pain. Animals, of course, they do feel pain. What I'm saying is that their pain does not matter morally. Yes, when an animal feels pain, it's bad for the animal, but it's not bad in a morally significant sense because that pain is not within the context of a being who is able to pursue what's good and avoid what's evil. And so something that can feel pain will have a richer experiential life, but that doesn't matter if it doesn't have moral knowledge. Our pain matters because we're moral agents. My pain is morally significant because I'm the kind of being able to pursue what's good and avoid what's evil. But animals don't have that kind of mind. And so while they might have a complex mental life, that mental life is still not the kind of mental life necessary for moral status. So does pain matter? Not intrinsically. Pain only matters in the context of a being who already has moral standing, and having moral standing is a matter of being rational. Second pro-vegan argument. Well, I guess there's a rejoinder to this, and the rejoinder is, well, why is animal cruelty wrong? Right? The argument here being that, well, animal cruelty is wrong because it harms the animal. You're violating the animal's interests, and so if you adopt the account of moral standing that I've given here, how do you account for the wrongness of animal cruelty? Well, animal cruelty is wrong, and animal cruelty does harm the animal, but it's not wrong for that reason. It's through harming the animal that the person who is cruel harms himself. Animal cruelty is wrong because it reflects a cruel disposition on part of the person who is doing the harming. And so it's not totally inaccurate to say that, well, the interests of the animal are involved, but what makes animal cruelty wrong is not so much what it does to the animal, but what it does to the person. Again, it's through harming the animal the person harms himself. Now, you can be cruel to something that doesn't feel pain. You can be cruel to something. You can be cruel to something in a way that is bad for it, but doesn't harm it morally speaking. So, for example, let's say that I'm really angry one day, and I go through your flower garden, and I start tearing up your flowers, and I throw a fit, and I start cursing. Well, what I did was wrong, and part of the reason why what I did was wrong is because I damaged your flowers, but the flowers themselves don't have any morally significant interest. It's just that in harming the flowers, I show my cruel disposition, i.e. I harm myself. Or another example, I burn you in effigy, right? If I burn you in effigy, I am doing something, you might say, cruel to an inanimate object, but I'm not harming the inanimate object. I'm showing something cruel about myself. And so you can account for the wrongness of animal cruelty without having to confer moral status to animals. So all acts of cruelty harm the person being cruel intrinsically, independent of any empirical spillover. So one argument that David de Grazia gives is that, well, what if, and I think I'm paraphrasing here, what if there's only one person on Earth, and that person is cruel to animals, but he can't show his cruelty to someone else? Well, it would still be wrong because it's harming himself. We have obligations to ourselves, and every act of cruelty for cruelty's sake harms the person who's being cruel. Second pro-vegan argument, the argument from marginal cases. And I'm moving a bit fast here. The argument here is that if animals lack moral standing, then so do babies, so do infants, so do people in comas. Why? Because they're not rational. They can't think. And so we seem to have this very counterintuitive conclusion that if animals don't have moral standing, then all these other human beings don't have moral standing. Well, this argument doesn't work because take the case of someone who's in a coma, or a baby, or an infant, right? They're not at the moment expressing rationality, but they still possess a rational nature, whereas animals lack a rational nature completely. So the difference between animals and so-called marginal cases is that in people in comatose states, in babies and infants, there is a rational nature there. It's just not fully realized, or maybe it's being impeded. Human beings ought to be rational. It's proper to us, and that properness or that oughtness is explained by the fact that we already have an inherent disposition to rationality that may not always be present. It may be blocked, it may be damaged, it may not be realized, but it's still there. There are no such thing as marginal cases. Whereas for animals, the lack of rationality is proper to them. Animals, the fact that animals aren't rational doesn't reflect something lacking in them that's proper to them. Animals don't have those things by nature. So consider the difference between a human being who is blind and a rock. A rock can't see, a blind person can't see, but obviously there's a difference here, right? A human being who is blind should see, and that should is explained by the fact that that human being has a capacity to see that's being blocked, whereas the rock just doesn't have the capacity at all. And so there's a difference here that doesn't show that so-called marginal cases don't have rights or moral standing. There are actually, in my view, no such things as marginal cases. Next argument. This is in popular circles on the internet. This is called the name the trade argument. In the academic literature, it takes the form of the speciesist challenge to my position. And the argument here is that any particular trait you pick out that gives human beings moral standing but denies them to animals is going to be arbitrary. You're privileging humans because they're human. What's so special about being human? It's just a biological category. And the charge here is one of speciesism. You're privileging humans for no good reason. But this argument doesn't work. I gave an argument showing why moral standing must be linked to rationality. I'm not saying that human beings have moral standing just because they're human. No, I'm saying moral standing is connected to rationality, and all humans have a rational nature. Therefore, all humans have moral standing, but animals don't have a rational nature, so animals don't have moral standing. So the charge of speciesism is confused. It's not arbitrary. I gave an argument here. The claim I'm making is not that humans have moral standing merely because they're human, merely because they fall into a certain biological category, but because all human beings have a property, namely being rational, that's relevant for moral status. Next argument here, and this is a really popular argument that I see from PETA. And back when I taught at Florida Gulf Coast University, there was I was walking to class one day, and there are all these people handing out brochures. They had this giant flyer on the campus green, and so I approached one of them, and they identified themselves as being from some vegan outreach group. I don't think it was PETA, but it was a group like PETA. And this guy engaged me in a discussion. He said, well, you wouldn't eat your dog, would you? So if you wouldn't eat your dog, if you think it's wrong to eat a dog, why would you also eat a cow or a chicken? And he thought that was some kind of serious moral argument. Now, I'm not convinced at all. It's not wrong to eat dogs and cats. Why would it be? It certainly is odd. It certainly is strange to most people, at least in the United States. But that's because we've given special social value to our dogs and cats. They're honorary members of our family. We've given them that value. But why would it be wrong to eat dogs and cats inherently? I mean, maybe it's wrong because hey, they, my dog, Lassie has a special place, in my family that I've given to it. But intrinsically speaking, inherently speaking, I can't think of a reason why it would be wrong to eat dogs and cats. It's certainly probably strange to most people here, but in many countries in the world, people do these things without any kind of moral qualm. My parents are from China, and they grew up eating dogs and cats. Now, would I eat a dog or a cat? I mean, I guess I would. I probably would be a bit weirded out by it. I would probably think, it's a bit strange because at least where I am at right now, in the world, dogs and cats have special social value. But I don't really see why this is a convincing argument at all. I mean, if you look at other countries, for example, in India, cows are treated as sacred. And so eating a cow in India would be the equivalent of eating a dog in the United States. But why would that, what's exactly the argument here? All the value we give to dogs, cats, cows, or whatever are contingent on, what society attributes to them. And this is not to appeal to a kind of crude form of relativism. It's just to say that, we might give animals, cultural or social significance that, that creates an attitude where, if you were to eat a dog or a cat, it would be strange. It would appear revolting to us, but it's not wrong. These are just contingent associations we make. So the final argument I want to look at is the anti-essentialist argument. And this argument is made by many in the animal rights or the animal ethics literature. And it's that appealing to this idea of, essences, natures, all of that, the idea that humans are exceptional. And this is the way it's sometimes phrased. The idea that humans are exceptional is incompatible with what we know about evolution, because evolution teaches descent through modification. And descent through modification means that there is no categorical difference between human beings and animals. It's just that we all exist on this gradual continuum. The difference between human beings and animals is a difference in degree, not a difference in kind. And so there is no room for this idea that human beings are exceptional in a way that privileges them categorically above animals. And the reply to that is, first, this is only true under a materialistic interpretation of the science. Darwinian evolution itself does not show that human beings are not exceptional. Now, if you think of human beings as being exhausted by their physical parts, then maybe there is some pull here. But if you aren't committed to that view, if you think that maybe there's an immaterial part of us, if you think that we have immaterial minds, or that maybe a soul exists, or that there is some difference between us and animals that's not captured by the material, then this argument just doesn't work at all. There might be no fundamental biological differences, but that doesn't mean there's no fundamental differences at all. So this argument only works under a materialistic interpretation of the science, which is not itself a scientific claim. That is a philosophical approach to scientific methodology, or a way of viewing science that's not itself entailed by the science. In fact, you might make the argument that evolution has to presuppose essentialism in teleology. There's a lot of work being done right now from what are called the new essentialists. And the argument here is that if you look at evolution itself, if you look at chemistry, biology, physics, causation, all of these things presuppose the idea of essences. For example, there are some who make the argument that, at least within chemistry, the different elements, right, each have their own essential form, and that's what lets us distinguish between different kinds of elements, different kinds of chemicals, and so on and so forth. Some make the argument that causation has to be teleological because causation is goal directed. Some make the argument that evolutionary development has to rely on teleology, because otherwise how do you distinguish between various stages in development? And so it's not clear at all that evolution makes belief in essentialism and teleology hard to come by, or hard to accept, because the idea of evolution seems to actually presuppose that. And so this argument doesn't seem to work, although it's a really common argument in the academic literature, but it relies on a certain interpretation of evolution that is not itself suggested by the science. So, conclusion, it's okay to hunt and eat animals. So eat meat and eat it boldly. And if you're interested in a summary of everything I've said here, I've written quite a bit on this, but I've got one article that really takes everything here and packs it into a nice 3,000-word article that's really accessible to undergraduates. In fact, I assign it in my undergraduate classes just because I wrote it to an undergraduate audience. And that's my chapter, There's Nothing Wrong with Eating Meat, in Paul Copan and Wes Jameson's book titled What Would Jesus Really Eat? Now, the argument in that chapter is completely philosophical. The book is titled What Would Jesus Really Eat? But the argument in there doesn't rely on any specific appeal to religious doctrine or religious assumptions. But it is a great book, and I got 2 chapters in there. The second chapter is on a defense of human exceptionalism. I actually have a copy right here. So if you're interested, you can grab a copy of that book and read my chapters in there. But otherwise, feel free to have some bacon tonight or maybe a steak dinner. I'm probably going to have a steak dinner myself. Medium rare ribeye, the best way to cook a ribeye steak. So with that, I'll take any questions.
I've got one.
Sure.
So in regards to the